Hello and welcome to The Take with Sophy Ridge, live at 9 here in the heart of Westminster. Well, we're 2 days away from an announcement that could define the Liz Truss government after just 3 weeks in office. Friday's so-called mini-budget sounds like it will be nothing of the sort, with very big measures on tax and spending. Well, just today we found out the Treasury could spend a cool £25 billion to cut energy bills for business. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine has taken a sinister turn as Vladimir Putin mobilised more troops and made thinly veiled threats about using nuclear weapons. The period of national mourning is over, but the greatest tests for the new Prime Minister still lie ahead. So there is lots for us to talk about as we bring you takes from all sides over the next 60 minutes.
You're prepared to be unpopular, aren't you?
Yes. Yes, I am.
Well, we'll look at what unpopular decisions may mean for the UK economy, and we'll also be discussing this chilling warning from the Kremlin.
If there is a threat to the territorial integrity of our country and for protecting our people, we will certainly use all the means available to us. And I'm not bluffing.
Well, there have been protests on the streets of Moscow and resolute words from Western leaders today. We'll be discussing as well the ongoing cost of living crisis here in the UK and what the government plans to do about it with our viewers panel. There they all are for us this evening. Great to have you on today's show. We'll also have some top guests, including the Business Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Labour's Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Nandy, the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, Torsten, the former UK Ambassador to NATO, Sir Adam Thompson. Plus, we'll be talking to the former Conservative Minister, Helen Whately, and much more besides. All coming up on The Take. Hello, good evening. All in the name of economic growth. Liz Truss says she's prepared to take unpopular decisions. Well, that mini-budget on Friday looks set to contain a few, lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, for example. We're also expecting personal and business tax cuts, plus there are rumours of a cut to stamp duty. The new Prime Minister certainly isn't hanging around. Let's have a look at what's happened in her first few weeks in office.
Will your plan bankrupt Britain, Prime Minister?
This is the moment to be bold. We are facing a global energy crisis, and there are no cost-free options.
The firearms officer who fatally shot Chris Cabba in South London last week has been suspended.
So the family welcomed the IOPC's decision today to launch a homicide investigation.
The Ukrainians have taken, as we say, large swathes of territory.
If there is a threat to the territorial integrity of our country, we will certainly use all the means available to us. And I'm not bluffing.
We'll stand in solidarity against Russia's aggression, period.
Now, Liz Truss is at the United Nations in New York for her first foreign trip as Prime Minister.
You're prepared to be unpopular, aren't you?
Yes. Yes, I am. We want to work more closely with the United States, but also in reaching out to fellow democracies around the world, and we protect the freedom and future of our citizens.
We've got a little bit of breaking news to bring you right now, because we have just had the official readout of Prime Minister Liz Truss's meeting with the US President Joe Biden. Unsurprisingly, they're talking about the response to Vladimir Putin's comments. They said that they condemned Putin's recent belligerent statements on Ukraine. They agreed his actions highlight the need for allies to continue their economic and military support to Ukraine. And the Prime Minister updated President Biden on her recent announcement that the UK will recommit to at least the same level of defence support for Ukraine next year, at least the same level there. They also talked about the need to end the over-reliance, as they put it, on authoritarian states in terms of energy, and to try and reduce energy dependence on Russia specifically. And then finally, they also discussed the Northern Ireland Protocol, something, of course, that has been a matter of contention for the two. On the Northern Ireland Protocol, the Prime Minister and President Biden both agreed that the priority must be protecting the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, and preserving the gains of peace in Northern Ireland. So that is the readout from a Downing Street spokesperson for that meeting. Well, today the government confirmed it will be holding down the prices of gas and electricity for businesses, hospitals, schools and charities this winter. Well, that could cost some £25 billion, and that's on top of the £120 billion it could cost to keep bills down for domestic customers over the next 18 months. A little earlier, I spoke to Business Secretary Jacob Rees-Mogg. Given today's developments, I did start by asking about Vladimir Putin's threats over Ukraine.
Well, I think Putin's response is one that is worrying, that the war has not been going well for him, and therefore he is effectively doubling down. But as the Prime Minister has said, we stand full square behind the people of Ukraine and want them to succeed. So I think we've got to carry on giving our full support to the people of Ukraine and hope that Putin will realise that his illegal war is doing damage to the whole of Russia and is not in the interests of the Russian people and will not ultimately be successful.
Thank you. Just moving on to domestic policy now. Today you've set out your energy plan to specifically help businesses. Just explain to us the policy and the idea behind it.
Well, essentially, we will provide for businesses the support that we've provided for domestic gas and electricity users and indeed people on heating oil. That is to ensure that prices remain at an affordable level. Now, for domestic users, it was relatively straightforward because there was already a price cap and there are a relatively small number of suppliers. The business market is much more complicated and therefore we have had to come up with a solution that caps wholesale prices, which will feed through to the non-domestic sector, and that includes charities and care homes, hospitals and schools, as well as businesses.
And the freeze that you've introduced today lasts for 6 months. You know, if you're a head teacher or a hospital manager really worried about what happens if energy prices remain as high as they are now in 6 months' time, what reassurance can you give them?
The reassurance I would give is that, yes, it is announced for 6 months, but there will be a review in 3 months to see how the scheme is working. We've introduced very rapidly a very broad brush scheme that is covering every user of energy, with actually the only exception being gas-fired power stations. They're the only exemption from this help for obvious reasons. What we want to do is to review how it's working, see whether that is the right approach to support, whether it should be more targeted. But I think I can give some reassurance that at these levels, the government is very well aware that schools, hospitals, hospices, care homes and many businesses would not be able to cope with the level of fuel prices that we currently have.
OK, that does give a general sort of indication about your thinking on it. The other question I have is about how it's going to be paid for. What costings have you done?
Well, these will be announced by the Chancellor in the fiscal event on Friday, so I don't want to preempt him. But this is a very expensive scheme. This is the right thing to do because the cost, whether it falls on the taxpayer or on individuals and businesses, is very substantial. It is a substantial cost for the whole economy. But the unfortunate truth is that if this were to fall on individuals and onto businesses, many would not be able to afford it. Businesses would not be able to continue in operation. But the government's shoulders are broader and stronger. And that, in a sense, is what government is for, is to pick up the burdens that individuals cannot bear. And that is what we're doing. The cost would hit the economy one way or another anyway, but it's being taken on collectively rather than falling on individuals and non-domestic users.
You know, I have to say it's quite interesting listening to you talking about the broad shoulders of the government. To you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and again, Liz Truss is someone who spent the leadership election telling us that she was going to govern like a Conservative, and yet, really, she's announced one of the radical state intervention policies, the kind of thing that would make Jeremy Corbyn blush.
Well, you have to think, what is the state there for, fundamentally? And it seems to me that the state should leave us alone to lead our own lives as much as possible. But there are certain things that individuals cannot do for themselves. And that may be law and order, it may be defence of the realm. But in this circumstance, it is bearing a burden that has, because actually of Putin's illegal war, become unbearable. So the state is there when the individual can't bear the burden. And otherwise, of course, it should leave the individual to get on with his or her own life. So I think this actually fits a fundamentally conservative view of the role of the state. It's the last bearer of burdens.
Cornwall Insight reckons that it could cost £25 billion. Is that in the right region?
You're trying to tempt me to preempt the Chancellor, and I think that would be discourteous of me. I must leave the Chancellor to make his announcement on Friday.
Understood. Now, Liz Truss has also said that this is a government all about growth. We know the tax-cutting agenda that she wants to set out. Do you think there's also a case for looking at employment law, perhaps scrapping the 48-hour week?
Well, I think we should look at regulations, particularly in the context of retained EU law, to see what regulations are suitable for economic growth and which ones aren't. We now have the freedom to decide that, and that's one of the benefits of Brexit. But it's too early to announce any specific policies, but I'm looking forward to the retained EU law bill being introduced into Parliament shortly, which will have an expedited process for repealing unnecessary EU laws.
Do you think that the 48-hour week then could be an unnecessary EU law?
Well, you said that, not me. I think it's certainly something that people will raise. I don't want to preempt decisions that haven't been made, but we have to look at whether we have the right system of regulation in this country to maximise economic growth.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, their Business Secretary. Well, let's get Labour's take on all that now, shall we? Ahead of the party's conference, which starts this weekend, our Sunday show is going to be live from that conference in Liverpool, where we're joined now by the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Thank you for being with us. I've just been listening to the Jacob Rees-Mogg interview. I was quite interested what he said about the working week, the 48-hour week, as some regulation. We should look at all different regulations, particularly those under EU law. Do you agree with him?
I didn't hear the precise thing that he said about the 48-hour week, but I certainly got the general thrust that this is a government that is going to try to deregulate in order to fuel growth in the economy. I think the problem for them is that a lot of these ideas have been tried before. We've already had Rishi Sunak, for example, trying to scrap or lower stamp duty during the pandemic. It just pushed up house prices. It didn't help first-time buyers. In fact, there was quite a bit of evidence that it made housing affordability worse. I think the government really does need to think seriously about not just what help they're going to provide, but who pays for that help. That was the big unanswered question from that interview that you just did with the Business Secretary. Everybody accepts that businesses, families need help this winter. The question is, are we going to tax the profits of people who've done well in the last few years, or are we going to load more and more of that cost onto struggling small businesses and struggling families across the country?
As you say, it is an unanswered question still. We are asking it. Jacob Rees-Mogg says, look, we've got to wait till Friday, which I guess is 2 days away, to find out exactly how they do plan to pay from it. What else are you looking forward for on Friday?
Well, we've got to have a plan to help people now, and we've got to make sure that the burden falls on those who are most able to bear it. So, you know, as we've put forward plans to raise the digital sales tax, for example, so that the big internet giants pay a bit more, we think that would raise about £2 billion. We could use half of that to help energy-intensive industries who are really struggling right now, and the other half as a fund to raise the threshold for business rates relief, so that a lot of small businesses would be taken out of business rates altogether, and others would find that they had help with other costs at a time when energy prices are soaring. Those are the sort of proposals that we want to see the government bringing forward, not more of this loading more of the costs, displacing them onto businesses and families who are already struggling by higher taxes for a very long period of time. We want to see fairness in the system, and that's what the government has to answer.
I mean, I guess what they're trying to do with business, isn't it, is to try and remove some of that tax burden as well, particularly in the investment zones as well, potentially slashing taxes for business and even potentially for workers as well in deprived areas to try and boost growth. Is that something you think would be a good idea?
Well, this isn't a new idea. So this is an idea that's been around for a very long time. It was tried under the last Labour government. George Osborne, it was his big idea in 2011, and we've still got a lot of these. They're called enterprise zones at the moment. They're being renamed investment zones. The problem with what the government is briefing is that these are not particularly focused on deprived areas, and the areas that have them don't necessarily benefit. It doesn't seem that they'll get to keep any proceeds of growth that are developed there. And if what Jacob Rees-Mogg was hinting at is what eventually materialises, the situation for people in these zones could get far, far worse. If you're essentially saying to some businesses, you can come in, you won't pay any taxes, other businesses are going to have to take the strain. You're going to displace the amount of tax burden on some other businesses, but also you're going to cause real problems, because if they're not paying towards the infrastructure in those places for the roads and the schools and all of the things that sustain a place, who is going to pay for it? It's probably going to be taxpayers. So, government needs to think really seriously about this, because they've been warned by every senior economist that the plans that they're currently briefing out aren't going to create the growth that they need.
I just wonder, though, when you were talking about growth there, the one thing you can say about this government is we know what they stand for. Growth, right? We can sum it up in a word. We can argue about whether or not it's going to be effective or if it's going to work or not, but we know the policy principle that they stand for. Every policy is around that. What does Labour stand for?
Look, we've been pushing the government to get a growth strategy since the beginning of the year.
So growth, is that what you stand for?
But actually, Sophie, I would question this, because, I went into the first Prime Minister's questions with Liz Truss, and I think it was absolutely clear who she stood for. She stands for the few and not the many. That's why she's loading the cost of the energy proposals onto people and hard-working families, not onto the profits of the big oil and gas producers.
Everyone. And we can have, obviously, there is clearly a debate about whether or not that is true or not. But we know that this is a government that is ideologically, we can see what it is they believe in.
Growth only benefits everybody if everybody gains, but she has no plan to share the proceeds of that growth. She doesn't believe in redistribution. She believes in raising the cap on bankers' bonuses, but opposing pay rises that are in line with inflation for working people. It just doesn't stack up. And in the end, that will be the thing that undoes her, unless she changes course before Friday, and we very much hope she does.
I am keen to talk about Ukraine. It's such a big story. Many of our viewers can be really concerned about what Putin's been saying. He's called up 300,000 military reservists. It's the biggest mobilisation since World War I. Would Labour be doing anything differently if you were in government now?
We make no apology for the fact that the political parties in Britain are united about our response to Putin. We have to stand up to Russian aggression. We have to stand very closely with our allies in Europe and the United States and our NATO partners as well, in order to send a very clear and unequivocal message to Putin. And I listened to Liz Truss today. It's a very welcome change of tack from the approach that this government has taken for the last 12 years, finally taking Russian aggression seriously. The next bit of this jigsaw is that they've got to take seriously the influence of the Russian government in the United States. They've got to clean up illicit finance in the City of London and stop proposing measures which they've currently got that they're trying to get through the statute book to make it easier for foreign money to influence our politics.
Would you raise defence spending?
I think it's right to look at defence spending at the moment. I haven't seen the exact details of what they're proposing, but we've always been very supportive of the idea that you need to have a baseline of defence spending, which, until recently there was a consensus around a minimum of 2%. I think that defence is one of those things that people often think is an add-on, but look at what is happening.
So would you like it to go to 3% then?
I think we've got to make sure that our troops have and our intelligence services have exactly what they need in order to deal with the threats that we face. We've got a lot of states at the moment displaying extremely aggressive behaviour in lots of parts of the world, but to have Russia behaving like this on the edge of our own neighbourhood means that we've got to take this seriously.
OK, thank you very much for being on the programme, Liz and Nandy,
there.
Right, well, let's take a moment, shall we, and try and work out what we've learned so far. We are joined with our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, loitering in the wings, listening to those interviews there, I'm sure not off-putting at all to our guests. What is your main takeaways from what you've heard so far?
Well, it's really striking, Sophie, that here we are in the middle of a parliament, quite a long time since a general election, quite a long time until we assume the next general election, and we are seeing a massive shift in direction, huge change in the way that Britain is going to be governed. Here we are, 3 weeks into Liz Truss's premiership. massive tax cuts to be announced on Friday, massive scrapping of rules. Broad hint to you from Jacob Rees-Mogg that they would get rid of the 48-hour working week EU direct working time directive, which has been a cross that many Brexiteers have wanted to see scrapped, but also huge spending, which you wouldn't necessarily associate with free marketeers like Liz Truss and Jacob Rees-Mogg, on a scale that perhaps might actually unnerve the markets, raising questions about just how safe it is to borrow and to borrow UK gilt, UK government debt. So that's a big change from what we saw under Boris Johnson, with a new team in Number 10 not afraid to tell the old Boris Johnson lot that they got it wrong. Liz Truss out in New York this week saying, I'm totally prepared to be unpopular. So we've got more of an ideological divide than we have had, I think, at any point in the last few years. But this is both an opportunity and a challenge for Lisa Nandy. What was striking about how she addressed it is that Labour have to work quite hard, I think, to shift their response to this. Some of the answers she was giving not really taking account of the new energy policies announced by Jacob Rees-Mogg today. You heard her talking about money for energy-intensive industries. Well, today the government said that they were going to basically freeze the energy bills of those sorts of companies. So quite why they're still talking about that, I wasn't clear. But how is Keir Starmer at Labour conference in Liverpool from SASI going to use that new space that's opened up? Well, I think that's a very big question for him, possibly one that will determine his future.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It feels like there's a real clash of ideologies at the minute going on. Perhaps the attacks on Boris Johnson from Labour were more about competence and delivery. Well, now it's ideology. Thank you so much, Sam Coates, there. Now, as we've been discussing tonight, Vladimir Putin is mobilising some 300,000 additional troops. It's the biggest since the Second World War, as his forces struggle in Ukraine. Well, some 800 people have been arrested in Russia today in protests against the war. So just how dangerous is the cornered Russian president, and what can the West do now? Well, we can speak now to Sir Adam Thompson, the former UK ambassador to NATO and director of the European Leadership Network. Thank you so much for being with us. Oh, let's just put that question to you. How dangerous is Vladimir Putin right now?
Well, it's getting more dangerous, certainly. I don't think we're yet at the worst of this crisis, which has got really quite a long way to go, not just through a difficult winter, but also into a new fighting season in the spring and summer of next year. His nuclear threats are designed to try and frighten the West in particular and split it off from its support for Ukraine. But we haven't yet, as far as I am aware, seen any heightened Russian state of alert for its nuclear forces, for example. And there are plenty of other steps that Putin can take to escalate this situation short of actual use of a nuclear weapon. So it's more of the same, in a sense, of Russia trying to use its nuclear power status to steal territory. But it isn't yet, I think, a really actual threat. I suspect that although Putin is in a difficult spot, he probably does half believe that this partial mobilization will make a difference. And it might indeed prolong the conflict, but I don't think it will change the direction of travel, because Russia depends not just on men, and most of these new ones will be poorly trained, but also on weaponry and ammunition, and he's already been reduced to buying weaponry and ammunition from North Korea.
You mentioned a little earlier in your answer saying that there are steps that Putin can take to escalate the conflict that aren't the use of a nuclear weapon. What kind of steps are you talking about?
He can even more aggressively than he has done already target not just Ukrainian civilian targets, but Ukrainian infrastructure. He's already been playing around with the risks to nuclear power plants, but there's much more he can do to cripple the Ukrainian economy if he puts his mind to it. And he can also, God forbid, but try and target Ukrainian decision makers, President Zelensky himself, and targets in Kiev that have been left untouched for quite a number of months now. There's really, I repeat, a long way to go. Putin will be hoping desperately, I think, increasingly desperately, that by squeezing Europe on energy this winter and threatening dire retribution if anybody touches Russian territory, he will start sowing doubts and split Western cohesion, breaking Europe and the United States away from Ukraine. That's his goal, and I think he still believes he can achieve it, even though he's clearly in a considerable domestic political crisis. On Friday last, he was saying that he had no change of plans, and now he's done something that we know from Western intelligence sources he really, really did not want to do, which is at least partial mobilization, which makes the war so much more real for people in the big Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg.
I'm interested in what could happen within Russia. We were talking about the number of people, arrested in Russia. You're speaking there about how the war could become more unpopular because of this mobilisation. What do you think the reaction in Russia could be? And is there a chance, I guess, that it could be some kind of uprising in Russia that tries to stop the war or even, overthrows Putin, I guess?
Well, this is an increasingly fluid crisis for all concerned, and so I suppose it's rash to rule out any scenario. But President Putin, as a good KGB officer, has a very, very, very good grip on security in Russia, and I don't think uprising is particularly likely. But we have just seen him cave in on a critical policy matter to Russian hawks, who are even further to the right of him. So he is politically vulnerable, even if he's not facing a palace coup or popular demonstrations that get out of control. I feel that in some ways his announcement today marks the beginning of a long, slow end to the Putin era.
Mm. That's interesting to hear your assessment of how he is politically and the strength that he has politically in Moscow. What, as far as you're aware, is the situation on the ground? We've obviously had these weeks where we've been told about these very strong Ukrainian advancements, then other reports that perhaps there's more resistance from Russia than they were finding initially. What's your assessment of where the war is at?
I don't have any great inside knowledge, but my impression is that the scale of the Russian withdrawal has been more damaging politically than militarily. Some Russian forces have withdrawn in good order. They're perhaps now on better defended lines than they were before, and it's quite likely that in the northeast, the Ukrainians are going to find it difficult to make significant further advances between now and when winter descends and it gets a bit more difficult and Ukrainian capacity really runs out. So I think the Ukrainians have done what they needed to do before the winter, which is to persuade their Western backers that they can win, they can make progress, provided they are supported economically and militarily by the West. But we may not see much more in the way of big change on the ground for some months to come now.
OK, thank you very much. It's been really interesting to talk and getting your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
You are watching The Take. We're live in Westminster for you this evening. Up next, we'll be talking to our viewers panel to find out what people at home make of what they've heard so far. Hello, welcome back. We're live in Westminster and you're watching The Take. Well, now we're just 2 days away from what could be a very significant so-called mini budget on Friday. It probably won't be mini at all. So I think it's a good time to bring in our viewers panel and find out, well, what they'd like to hear from the Chancellor, but also to try and get a bit of a sense of how people around the country are really finding the inflation crisis that we are seeing. Great to have you all here. Thank you for being with us. Let's go to Smeet first, shall we? Smeet Thacker, you're talking to us from Leicester. How worried have you been about the cost of living?
Good evening, Sophie. Yeah, incredibly well. I've been getting it from all ends. So I also live in a old townhouse. And we just service charges more than before without any intervention from any authority or any justification. The energy prices. I travel a lot from work, and the prices of the pump haven't come down, like the wholesale costs.
Smeet, I'm so sorry. Your microphone is breaking up for us. I did get the gist of what you're saying. You're talking about fuel prices being really, really high, the prices of the pump being difficult, and obviously you're travelling for work, as you say, as well. But I'm going to have to stop you there just because the sound isn't quite good enough for us to go on. We will try and come back to you later if possible. Let's go to John instead, shall we? John, you're talking to us from Kent. Now, you're a pensioner, aren't you? How are you finding the cost of living crisis?
I'm coping, but quite well. But there's a lot of people that aren't, and I think the government needs to do something more to support the pensioners that are purely on state pension. They've already taken away the triple lock to help. The only pensioners are going to get, unless they're disabled or like that, but is the increase in the winter fuel. Plus, obviously, the £400 that everybody else is getting. And when you take into account that there's a lot of pensioners living on their own, purely living on a state pension, those people are going to struggle.
Good point, isn't it, about those people, as you say, who are struggling, pensioners in particular, who won't necessarily benefit from some of the help announced. Right, let's bring in Lisa, shall we? Lisa Goddard, who is talking to us from Birmingham today, Lisa. Lisa, how reassured have you been at the energy price announcement? We heard a bit from Jacob Rees-Mogg earlier.
I'm relieved that we've got an idea of what's coming and that we've got a fixed price. I've been really worried about the energy bills and concerned about fuel, etc. So I am pleased that we've got a fixed price, but I'm concerned about only having 6 months for businesses. What that'll mean for ongoing impacts with instability, I'm not sure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really is a concern for people, isn't it? But as you say, good to get a bit of a direction of travel on what you're doing on energy. OK, we can talk to Ros next. There you are, Ros. Now, Ros, I know you're a sort of former head teacher, national leader in education, and obviously lots of heads at the minute are going to be really worried about schools. Jacob Rees-Mogg seeming to suggest that the help will be extended past 6 months, but, certainly a worrying time.
Yes, I'm very worried for schools because the thing is, we weren't in a good place. Our schools were not in a good place. None of our public services have been in a good place now for a very long time. So the help is very welcome. But one of the things that's happened recently is that school teachers have been awarded a pay rise, a much deserved pay rise, which everybody's very pleased they've got, but it's unfunded. Now, school budgets are under tremendous pressure. The help with energy, of course, we welcome. But I know, I train head teachers all over the country, and everybody is talking about their stress and their worry about budgets and the pressure on school budgets. We're seeing an attrition rate of school leaders now. People are not coming forward. We have vacancies. Budgets don't balance. actually public services are really facing a crisis. I'm an expert in the education service, but if we listen to everybody in the health service, what they're saying is actually this crisis that they're facing, it's not about COVID, it's because they weren't in a fit state even before COVID. Our public services are literally on their knees, and that should be the priority of this government.
OK, thank you so much for talking to us today. Ros there, strong feelings on schools. I'm more worried about public sector as well. We can bring in Chloe now. Let's bring in Chloe Forrest, shall we? You're a nurse, you're talking to us from Cumbria, and I know you're a Conservative voter. You voted for Boris Johnson, although you I guess, towards the end of the last series of the programme, you were questioning whether or not he was the right man for the job. What do you make of Liz Truss?
To be honest, I'm not a fan. I think it's very concerning when your Prime Minister of the country isn't that bothered if she's liked or not. If she's got the support of the people that she's leading. And then, at the side of her, we've got Therese Coffey that doesn't really ever know what's going on and doesn't ever have any answers to anything. So that concerns me a little bit, where they just don't seem to care like other people in the past have. I think it's more of what you can be and a bit of a show, which it worries me a little bit, to be honest.
Would you vote for her, just quickly?
Pardon?
Would you vote for her?
No.
OK. Interesting. Well, let's bring in another Conservative voter, shall we? Let's bring in Roy Royer from Kent. Roy, do you agree on Chloe's assessment of Liz Truss?
No, I'm completely the opposite. I think I was doubtful of her to begin with, but I must admit, right from the get-go at Prime Minister's questions, her first one, she surprised me. And since then, she's been pretty good, actually. I like the way that she's pulled together the cabinet, the people that she's put in cabinet, the mix of cabinet in terms of diversity. There are more black people in there. I can see some white people shaking their heads, but do you know what? We've been waiting for a while to get some better representation. The people she's put in, Jacob Rees-Mogg just now, just screamed common sense as far as I'm concerned. There are many people who are not liking him, mainly because of his background. I don't have blue eyes. Do I get upset about somebody who didn't pick their eyes? He didn't pick his background. He just happened to have been born into that background, and he made the best of it. I was born into what I had, and I tried the best I could to make the best of what I had. So I'm quite hopeful. I think Britain needs to get its swagger back. That's the problem. We talk the country down too much.
OK. Great to hear.
Yeah.
Great to hear diversity of views. Now, while I've got you, we've got splits in opinion on Truss with our two Conservative voters. But if I was going to ask you all, and remember, we have got, I think it's 3 Labour, 3 Conservative, so we're going to have, that just to bear in mind with the panel. If you've all got a pen and paper by you, I'd like you to have a think and write down a word that comes into your mind when I asked you about Liz Truss. What word would you say sums up Liz Truss? We're on TV, obviously, so keep it clean, please. I'm trusting you guys here. Always really interesting to take the temperature of what everyone thinks. Right, we're getting a couple of questions now through. We have one, nuts being held up. Surprising from Roy, obviously in a good way. Inconsistent, so says one of our panellists. Delusional from Chloe, not a fan of Liz Truss there. Out of her depth. From Smee, and questionable. So a real range of views here. Thank you so much. Always great fun to talk to you. Thanks for being good sports today on the panel. Now, what is certain is the Liz Truss premiership is likely to see a return to ideological economic policy in a way we haven't seen in the UK for decades, because the new Prime Minister has made it very clear she's not interested in who gets what as long as the overall economy gets bigger. So we're expecting tax cuts, but also borrowing with tens of billions of pounds of spending on energy bills support. Well, let's speak to the Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation, Torsten for his view on today's announcements. Thank you so much for being with us. You tweeted earlier today to say that Friday's mini-budget won't be remotely mini, big tax cuts, big tax reforms, big increases in borrowing. What are you expecting?
Well, we're expecting a big package, as I was spelling out. I mean, Liz Truss has already said, and she's committed to very large tax cuts. Those are to corporation tax and to national insurance. Mainly that's about saying that she doesn't agree with the tax rises that Rishi Sunak either put in place or was about to put in place when he was Chancellor. So she's got a big package there. On top of that, obviously, the global economy developments with gas prices mean she's already put in place very big measures, increasing borrowing very significantly over this year and next to pay for support for households and the support for businesses that you've been discussing on the programme this evening. And then on top of that, we've got a deterioration in the economy, which means that we're seeing higher interest rates and higher inflation, and that will lead to higher borrowing on its own. So the combination of all three of those means that what we're going to learn about on Friday is a very, very big increase in government borrowing.
And how concerned should we be, or not, about a big increase in government borrowing?
Well, I mean, your listeners and viewers are probably used to hearing over the last few years very large borrowing figures because that's how we got through the pandemic. And obviously the financial crisis before that also included large amounts of borrowing as we had to nationalise some of our biggest banks. So I think, you know, there are reasons you need to do that. I think what we're seeing, though, is a choice here. It's pretty much unavoidable that we were going to be doing more borrowing as the economy slowed, but also that we would do more borrowing to cope with these truly exceptional increases in energy prices. I think it's completely reasonable that the government's saying, look, some of these energy price rises are likely to be temporary, and so borrowing from tomorrow's taxpayers to help today's bill payers makes good sense. What they're doing on top of that, though, is not doing as much as they could to mitigate how much borrowing that help with energy bills requires, either by going further on windfall taxes or actually by capping the windfalls that companies are making, particularly renewable or nuclear electricity generators who are seeing big windfalls, even though they don't have anything to do with gas or oil production. And then on top of that, she's saying now's the time for lower taxes than my predecessor thought we needed. So there's things that are unavoidable about higher borrowing, but then on top of that, she's making choices not to minimise some of the increase in borrowing, and then on top of that, to choose to have lower taxes too.
I mean, I guess what Liz Truss's team would say is that this is all part of trying to inject growth into the economy. So lower taxes, they hope, will stimulate growth. Some of the energy changes will help bring down inflation. All of these things are good news for the economy. I mean, do you think there's merit in that argument?
There's definitely merit in saying it's a good idea for the British government to be focused on growth. The last 15 years have been a period of relative decline for the UK economy. We've been outgrown by most other major advanced economies, and that is making us all poorer. The bottom, the middle and the top are all worse off because of that slowdown in our economy. So she's right to focus on that, and she's right to say that that will involve doing some unpopular things. Cutting taxes isn't actually that unpopular a thing, you'll recognise, and also the level of taxation isn't the most important thing in determining your growth rates. Lots of the economies that have grown faster than us have higher rates of tax, and the United States has significantly lower rates of tax and has grown faster than us. So I think the role of tax in driving economic growth is understated compared to, for example, firms being able to build things when they want to, or us having the right levels of skills in our workforce, or indeed the right numbers of workers. And actually firms investing is important for our growth rates, but it isn't really lower corporation tax that tends to drive that.
I just want to have a look at a couple of charts, if I may. The first one this is from the Resolution Foundation, so hopefully you'll be quite familiar with them. The first one shows the impact of the policy changes introduced by Liz Truss in 2022 to 23. And then just quickly to go to the next one, because this is the one that's really interesting. The second year, 2023 to 4, really shows here how the planned policy changes do disproportionately help richer households. So if you like the ones towards the richer scale, the number 10, the richest households benefiting most from those policy changes. I mean, Liz Truss at least has been quite open about this, hasn't she? To say that she doesn't necessarily think that it's a problem if the wealthier households disproportionately benefit from some of those policies.
Yeah, I mean, what those charts show is, firstly, there's a lot of support going in from that's been announced by Liz Truss, but was also put in place by the previous government under Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. So there's a lot of support going in with a number of different measures. Overall, this year, that's providing quite a lot of support to low-income households, middle-income households, and high-income households. It's providing roughly the same support to all of those income groups, even though obviously it's lower-income households that will be suffering most from rising energy bills. They don't have savings to draw down on. They can't cut back on expensive holidays to pay the energy bill. Now, if you look at next year, the chart you're showing now, you're right that when you combine the dropping away of lots of the support that's more focused on the bottom and the middle this year, and then you add on top, and you have a energy price guarantee, that's the price cap, the 2,500 price cap for households and their energy bills that goes to everybody, but you add on top of that the big cut to national insurance that they're planning to announce on Friday, then it is the higher income households that see most support next year. Now, Liz Truss has said that the national insurance rise that she wants to reverse, she recognises benefits richer households. I think whether or not you believe in that level of national insurance, you want it up or you want it down, I think what it definitely isn't is a good way to target support at people during this cost of living crisis. I think there are good arguments for a higher level low of taxes. But
Thank you very much indeed, Torsten Bell there. Torsten Bell there talking about what he thinks the government may do on Friday. A little earlier, we spoke to the Conservative former Minister, Helen Whately, the former Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, to find out what she thought.
The first thing for me as a former Treasury Minister, also as a constituency MP, is I know people have been worrying so much about their energy costs and the energy bills and the cost of living. So I'm really glad that the first thing Liz Truss has done as Prime Minister is already make a big announcement about helping people with the cost of energy through the winter. And then today we've had the announcement on support for businesses, which will be a huge... Businesses will be breathing a huge sigh of relief. Think about that and knowing that they're going to get help through the winter with the energy costs.
Are you worried about how it's going to be paid for?
Oh, well, of course, and you were just asking me about Friday. So what I'm looking forward to seeing on Friday is the Chancellor setting out his plans for economic growth. That's a really big part of his agenda, about our new Prime Minister's agenda. Really, really important to the country. We've been through such difficult times. We still are in difficult times. But the best way through anything we know is for economic growth. That's the best thing for everybody. That's how we get higher wages, job opportunities, goes through into people having more money to spend, better standards of living.
It looks like we're going to get some tax cuts. Some of them, of course, have been spoken about previously. Stamp duty is another that's been floated in the papers today. Is now the right time to cut taxes, given high inflation?
It's a good question. I would say on inflation, clearly we do have high inflation right now, but looking ahead, and the Bank of England is expecting for inflation to come down, expecting energy prices to come down, which is particularly driving that, and we've got the support with the cost of energy, which will help through the winter on that. And then, in 2 years out, Bank of England is expecting inflation to come back down to around about 2%. And there's clearly a balance. The government doesn't want to do things that drive inflation, but we also have a recessionary risk at the moment, and we don't want to see that kind of economic slowdown. We want to see, instead of that, we want to see growth. So this is exactly the job for the Chancellor.
But you accept that tax cuts could fuel inflation?
Well, actually, I think, one of the benefits of the decisive action taken by the Prime Minister and Chancellor on energy is that will help control inflation, and clearly controlling inflation.
But on tax cuts, it is, like the IFS, for example, says that, it could increase inflation.
Well, as I said, the remit of the Bank of England and its independence is to take steps through their policies to control inflation, and they'll just set out what they're saying about inflation at the moment. And I think we do have against that the risk of some concern about sort of recession and the importance of economic growth. So I think actually I think this is a really, really positive agenda, which I'm looking forward to getting behind.
I'm keen to ask about fairness as well. If you look at some of the policies that we're seeing from Liz Truss, stamp duty cuts, corporation tax being lower than planned, scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses, is this a government that looks like it's just on the side of the wealthy?
Well, the first thing I'd say on that is actually, if you look back over the last few months, going back to around about this time last year, last winter, there has been substantial support put in to help people on lower incomes.
This is before Liz Truss was Prime Minister, though, isn't
yeah,
it?
but it's all still, I mean, it's worth looking at it in the round, because these things are continuing. So, for instance, the support that was announced before the summer recess, I was involved in the Treasury in developing that package, which is £1,200 to households on lower incomes, extra help for pensioners, extra £150 for people with disabilities going out today.
I'm looking forward at what the new Prime Minister
Yeah.
is doing, that these are the policies that she wants to do: stamp duty cut, corporation tax cuts, or cancelling rises, scrapping caps on bankers' bonuses. It's a valid question. How does it work?
Well, but I was just coming to that. And I'd say, no, do look at it in the round, that those steps have been taken particularly to help those on lower incomes. And in fact, some of the tax cuts that have happened over the last year, for instance, the universal credit taper change, essentially a tax cut to those on lower incomes. So those things have already happened. But clearly the way that Liz Truss as Prime Minister, Kwasi as Chancellor, are looking at this is then really focusing on economic growth as being the way that they increase the size of the pie. So overall, rather than just saying, well, you know, this is the size of the UK economy, and how do we redistribute that amongst people, to say, well, actually, let's look at how we can invest and how we can increase the size of the UK economy, and that will be good for everybody.
You obviously backed Rishi Sunak in the leadership election. You're sitting here basically because you can do what you want now. You don't have, you're not part of the government any longer. Do you think you were punished by backing the wrong horse?
I don't see that at all. I mean, what I do see is looking at the cabinet that Liz Truss has brought together, and really talented people, many of my good friends, very capable people.
The vast majority of them who backed her for the leadership.
In that cabinet. Well, I mean, it is a normal thing that somebody who becomes a leader has people who are loyal to them and who've helped them on their journey there. Around them. I completely understand that. But also, really talented colleagues. There's real diversity, but people who are there because of their merit, not because of particularly their background. I think that's a real strength of Liz's government.
And are you enjoying your newfound freedom?
So far, so good.
OK, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks
Helen
very
Whately
much.
there. Helen Whately there, who obviously backed Rishi Sunak, didn't get a job in the Liz Truss administration. Well, let's bring in Sam Coates, shall we? Grant Shapps, another person who backed Rishi Sunak. What happened to him?
2 weeks ago, he walked into Liz Truss's office to find out whether or not he was going to be allowed to stay as Transport Secretary. I've discovered the contents of that conversation. Liz Truss told Grant Shapps, "You are one of the most competent Secretaries of State and probably the best communicator in government, but you didn't back me, and there's no room at the inn." And he was out in the cold. Probably going to be broadly loyal, but I think that story is whizzing round Tory backbenchers at the moment, because it makes it very hard for Liz Truss to claim that she's got a government of all the talents when she says the best Secretaries of State and the best communicators are on the outside because they didn't back her. There is a sense there's a bit of divide and rule at the moment that's not going down well with parts of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. She hasn't done herself any favours with that anecdote.
I mean, I guess she says she's prepared to be unpopular. She's being open.
Absolutely.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates, always good to talk. Well, that is it for The Take. We'll be back next week and every week on Wednesday at 9 p.m. Next up, it is Sky News at 10. Thanks very much for watching. See you next week.
There are now 2 billion people shopping on laptops and phones 24 hours in every zone. If you do business online, no need to do it alone. We'll help you keep up with the clicks.